And see, that's not part of the recording. Good. The first time I heard the Buddha story, I'll just mention it really quickly. It was in Folsom State Prison, and it was a volunteer told it to the group. His name is Terry, and I remember I was telling Nancy and Nut about this. We were talking the other day. He started crying in the middle of the story, and I had absolutely no idea what was wrong with him when he told the story of the Buddha. And it's funny because here I am 15, 16 years later now, and I get it now. But I did not get it at the time. But that was the first time that I heard it. So Vesak is the celebration of the birth, the life, the awakening, and the death of, I'll just say, the Buddha of this age. There have been prior Buddhas. I will not be telling their stories. But you could start the tale of the Buddha in prior lifetimes, because the tales do go back into prior births. But we will stick with this birth. So 2,500 years ago in what we could think of as modern day Nepal or ancient India, neither of which existed at the time. There was the prince of or king of the Sakya clan. His name was Suddhodana, and his wife Maya were about to have a child. And as was custom, I suppose, at the time, they decided to have a seer or a prophet do a reading to see what would happen with the child. And the prophecy that came about was that the future child would be a son, and that he would be either a great king, a Dharma leader, or a great holy man, someone who renounced the world but led people on a path towards the end of suffering. Now, both of these are great things, but you can also understand why a king would, of course, want his child to follow in his footsteps. And so Suddhodana decided that he would, once the child was born, make sure that he steered his child in the direction of kingship rather than a renunciate or following the holy life. So Siddhartha Gautama was born, the son to Suddhodana and Maya, and his mother Maya passed away 7 days after his birth. We can assume that it was related to pregnancy. I heard one American Dharma teacher once describe the death of Maya as young Siddhartha's earliest trauma, and that the suffering that may have resulted from not having his mother around is something that may have played a significant role throughout his life. Nothing, of course, is mentioned in the scriptures about that specifically, but it's something that we could kind of intuit from the circumstance. So he was raised in this court. He was a member of what was called the Kshatriya class, or Varna, as they're called in ancient India. So it meant he was part of the ruling and military class of society. So he wasn't going to be working hard or anything like that. He lived in this court. He was raised by his aunties. And he was raised to be a future king of some sort. He was raised to learn the religious traditions of the time, what we would think of as ancient Vedic religion. He was raised with sensual pleasure around him, wanting for nothing. As Siddhartha grew up, he nonetheless he was a smart kid, and he had he had an inquisitive nature. His father noted in him that there was like a subtle dissatisfaction with life despite having everything provided for. And of course, this is what his father feared most. And so as part of his project to make sure that Siddhartha didn't grow up to be a holy person, he sheltered him from what most people would think of as the things that would lead one to choose a spiritual life. So he sheltered him from aging. He sheltered him from sickness. He sheltered him from death. He certainly sheltered him from those scantily clad yogis that lived out in the forest who were practicing meditation all the time and trying to find an end to suffering. And so some of this comes from scripture, but some of it is part of like the traditional story, and I'm mixing it all together. But I try to imagine, Suddhodana, whenever Siddhartha would be leaving the palace, like sending a messenger out to the village, going like, my son's coming, like old people need to go hide in their house, funerals are canceled, like, like get your your sick grandmother in the house as well, whatever. Like you're just imagining like these sort of things happening ahead of time every time Siddhartha would leave the house. But you can't miss everything. And there's one story of Siddhartha being near a field where workers are harvesting, vegetables or wheat or something like that. And he saw that those people's lives were very different than his own. That here he was in a, basically wanting for nothing and not having much suffering whatsoever. And those people's lives were characterized by hard labor and hard work. And it just kind of sparked curiosity in him such that, he's like, why is the world this way? Like something else is going on. And so this subtle dissatisfaction, this word that we've come in Buddhism to call dukkha, is something that characterized his life despite having everything he needed and everything he could have wanted. There is a tale of that Siddhartha, later on the Buddha, mentions, and he recalls it later in life, that there was an instance when he was a teenager and he was in an orchard sitting beneath an apple rose tree, and that something happened in a particular moment. It was beautiful. It was the cool shade of a tree on a hot summer day. And something happened that made him realize a certain degree of mental calm and pleasure. And it's said that he entered an absorptive meditative state right there. And the suffering that he experienced was temporarily gone. It was temporarily receded and faded from existence. And this is something he would remember later on, and we'll come back to it later on in his story. But he remained inquisitive. His father was worried that he would become a holy man. And so there's no better way to distract a person from the spiritual path and existential questions than for him to get married. So his father found a wife for him, and there are tales about the search for a wife and what have you, but we can skip some of those. Some of them are kind of like Robin Hood. There's arrow shooting stories, over mountaintops and splitting arrows and targets and all that fun stuff. But we can skip all that. And a woman named Yasodhara was found, and Siddhartha and Yasodhara were married, and they loved each other very much. Still, Siddhartha remained inquisitive, and there was still this subtle dissatisfaction with life. So what a better way to distract one from the suffering of life than children? So his father encouraged them to have children, and that's what they did. They had one, and a son was born named Rahula. And if I remember correctly, Buddhist texts are sometimes not unironic in their way of like naming people, but if I remember correctly, Rahula means obstacle. So like it would be kind of like an interesting name to name one's child if you think of it in terms of like preventing him from following the spiritual path. But as we know, none of this stopped him. And so, he went through his teenage years and he went into his adulthood and finally like well into his 20s. And it's hard to imagine a person escaping like seeing suffering this much in their life, but that's how the tale goes. At some point, he decided to sneak out of the palace and bring his chariot driver with him. Now, of course, I don't think they drove in the chariot because then they would have seen him coming. So I imagine them kind of going out in the palace and getting like some different clothes on and like sneaking in like into the village so nobody knew they were coming. And this is where Siddhartha sees what are called the 4 signs. And the first sign was, of course, one of the things that his father wanted him not to see. It was an old person. I imagine a kind of an old guy walking down the street with a cane, hunched over, moving kind of slow, a little gray, a little wrinkled, nothing against anybody who happens to be that in the room. But this is what he saw. And he's, like I imagine a conversation like, what's up with that guy? And Chana, the chariot driver, he's like, well, he's old. And Siddhartha's like, well, why does that happen? And Chana's like, that happens to me. It'll happen to you. It happens to everyone. And so the trip continued. And then Siddhartha saw a sick person. I always imagine this as, and maybe it's because of my Catholic upbringing, I always imagine the sick person as a leper. of some sort, like missing like some body part or some like terrible illness that's obvious from afar, you know. And Siddhartha's like, what's up with that guy? And again, Shauna's like, well, he's ill. And, you know, it'll happen to you, it'll happen to me, it happens to everyone. And then this journey continues. And as is common in India today, it was just common back then as well, a funeral procession is happening. And a corpse getting carried down the street en route to the river for cremation. And Siddhartha sees this corpse and he's like, what is wrong with that guy? And Shauna's like, he's dead. It'll happen to me. It's going to happen to you. It's going to happen to everyone. And of course, this stuff perturbs Siddhartha. And on their way back to the palace, they pass by a kind of a grove of trees, and beneath one of the trees is sitting one of these ascetics, one of these yogis that his father didn't want him to see. Imagine this person in rags, maybe not wearing much clothes, maybe some dreadlocks and some dirt all over their body. Everything about them would suggest that they were suffering significantly, but the only difference was that this person who was meditating beneath the tree seemed to have a look of peace and calm and pleasure even on his face. And what's up with that guy? Says Siddhartha. And Shauna says, well, that's a holy man. He's trying to find an end to suffering. And by the looks of things, he's doing a pretty good job at it. And so I imagine that that moment would have been when Siddhartha made his decision. And so at the age of 29, Siddhartha left his wife, he left his child, and he left the palace behind. I've heard one version of the story that says that Siddhartha couldn't get the gumption to leave during the daytime, where he'd have to look any of the people he loved in the face when he left. And so he stole away in the middle of the night. In fact, that was the point when I heard this story that Terry cried when I listened to the story in Folsom, was when he left the home life. And so, as is also common in India today, many of these yogis, ascetics, meditators, they live in the wilderness. They don't live in homes. They've renounced the world to a certain extent. Siddhartha went to find them. He went out into the wilderness, the groves outside of town that are often given as a safe space for holy people to meditate and practice. He goes out there to find teachers. Now, this was a pretty amazing time in Indian history. And so like, I wish I could have been a fly on a bark of a tree back then. There was no walls to be on, so it would have been bark of a tree. And because there would have been Jains there would have been the Karvakas, there would have been Vedic like meditators and yogis. And I just imagine all these people kind of sitting around different traditions, like trying different things out and having arguments and debates. I mean, I would have loved it. So I imagine him going out there, and he finds his first teacher, and he practices with him. And he learns some significantly advanced meditative attainments, learns particular types of absorptive meditation. And during the absorptive meditation, he finds some peace. But the problem is that when he's done being absorbed and the mind kind of returns to the world, that dukkha, that subtle dissatisfaction remains. And so he became very skilled underneath this teacher, to such an extent that the teacher asked him to co-lead the community of his followers. And Siddhartha said, no, I need to move on because I haven't found what I'm looking for. And so he finds another teacher and does the same thing again, gets higher absorptions, more refined levels of meditative attainment. And he is asked to not just co-lead, but take over the community for that teacher. And Siddhartha says, no, I haven't found what I'm looking for. So he moves on. So there were a certain type of character practicing out there with all the yogis, and we would call them extreme ascetics. They practice what we might term mortification. And by mortification, they believed that since the body seemed to be the source of all of our suffering, that one needed to confront the suffering of the body head on, such to transcend it. And so they starved themselves. They put themselves in uncomfortable postures and positions. They laid and slept on beds of nails. They meditated near hot fires. They slept very little. They practiced pranayama, but in the traditional way, trying to breathe very little. They did things to themselves that most of us would think of as very, very, very unhealthy. And the Siddhartha went to practice with 5 of these ascetics. And I'm just going to quote the Buddha here from the Majjhima Nikaya. He says, "My body reached such an extreme state of emaciation. Because of eating so little, my limbs became like the jointed segments of bamboo stems. My backside became like a camel's hoof. My spine stood forth like corded beads. My eyes sank down in their sockets, looking like the gleam of water that is sunk down in a deep well. My belly skin adhered to my backbone. If I tried to ease my body by rubbing my limbs, the hair rotted at its roots, fell from my body as I rubbed. There were times when the Buddha kept falling over because he was suffering so much. He described in a different text that every time he tried to go to the bathroom, he would collapse. And he realized at some point that all he was doing was suffering more. He wasn't transcending the body. He was just hurting a lot, and that this wasn't the path. And that's when, and I'll quote from him again, "I recalled when my father, the Sakyan, was occupied, while I was sitting in the cool shade of an apple rose tree, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. I entered upon and abided in the first meditative absorption with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Following upon that memory came the realization, this indeed is the path to enlightenment." And so the Buddha decided that he was going to leave the ascetics. Now, in some instances of the story, he says he just started eating again. But there's also a traditional story in which he collapsed by the riverside, across the river from a town called Gaya, where a woman named Sujata found him and brought him rice porridge, rice milk, and nursed him back to health. And I like this version of the story because it indicates that a certain degree of compassion was required to bring the Buddha back to health, such that he would be able to find awakening. And so she helped him come back to health. And I imagine, he filled out and his hair got glossy black again and his skin was glowing and everything was awesome. And he looked wonderful. And there's a story where the ascetics saw him after he'd eaten and he looked healthy again, and they were mocking him, saying he'd given up the practice. Siddhartha crossed this river where he had met Sujata, and he found a peepal tree. And he sat beneath this peepal tree in the town, outside the town of Gaya. And he sat down in the evening to meditate. And he made a commitment right there that he would sit beneath this tree. Rain or shine, sink or swim, live or die, he was going to sit beneath that tree until he found the answer and the solution to suffering. So maybe we should sit with the Buddha a little bit. Sit with Siddhartha.
So friends, let's sit under the Bodhi tree with Siddhartha. Let's get our spine straight but not rigid. And begin to take some deep, nourishing breaths. And with each out-breath, begin to relax a little more, a little more, a little more. Letting go, letting go, letting go, releasing, releasing, releasing. And then letting the breath settle back to its own natural rhythm. And turn your attention to the sense of your body's all over aliveness, the subtle vibratory quality of energy moving in your body from the top of your head to the tip of your toes. And to help encounter this feeling of aliveness, it can help to think of the mind as a handful of salt and the body as a vase of warm water. Letting go of that handful of salt, let your mind dissolve all over your body. Rest in this sense of awareness and body as inseparable. When your mind is carried away by a thought, you can notice the sense of this inseparability fading. When you catch yourself noticing a thought, see it as an energy event. Thought arising out of the subtle body. Thought dissolving back into the subtle body. Nothing whatsoever needs to be pushed away. It's enough to stay with this all over aliveness of the body. And within this sense of all over aliveness, you'll notice there's a subtle movement of the inhale and the exhale. And subtle variations of sensation, like the feeling of air on your skin, maybe on your face, your hands. If you're not wearing long sleeves, maybe along your arms. And the coming and going of sound. These are like the waves in the ocean of the subtle body. Natural, arising, abiding, and subsiding. See if you can stay with the felt sense of this subtle, vibrant aliveness of your human body, natural and ever present. And to conclude the meditation, we enter a phase of release, letting go of any focus or effort, letting awareness open out, panoramic, relaxed, and free, without any attempt to constrain, confine, without even an effort to meditate. Just being with our senses wide open. With mind and heart open, dwell in the sacred energy body. As we return to the Sangha and to the story of the Buddha.
Thank you, Nancy. That's great.
So during the last meditation of the unenlightened Bodhisattva's life, he sat beneath that peepal tree. And during the first watch of the night, he applied his attention to his own life, to how karma works. He saw deeply into the power of intention and the impact it has on his own life, but then his own prior births. And he saw how the law of karma worked on his consciousness for all of his life and all of his prior births. And during the second watch of the night, he applied the same attention to all beings, all humans, all animals, all living creatures, and saw the subtle machinations of karma in the universe and how he was a part of that. And during the third watch of the night, and I'll quote from him, "My concentrated mind was purified. I inclined my mind to the knowledge of the exhaustion of mental effluence," distracting thought, basically. I had direct knowledge, as it actually is, that this is suffering, that this is the origin of suffering, that this is the cessation of suffering, and that this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. My heart was liberated from the taint of sensual desire, from the taint of being, and from the taint of ignorance. Birth is exhausted, I thought. The holy life has been lived out. What was done and what has to be done is done. There is no more of this to come. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who is diligent, ardent, and self-controlled. And Siddhartha was no longer a bodhisattva, he was a Buddha. And I imagined the pre-dawn light and like the rising of the morning star, like a new day dawning. And Mara, can't remember if I'd mentioned Mara yet, but Mara is like the, call him the Buddhist equivalent of the devil. He's a character that we can think of as a deity, but can also be thought of as kind of like a psychological component of mind. Mara usually represents greed, hatred, delusion, any of the hindrances and obstacles that prevent us from seeing clearly and from our own hearts being liberated. So Mara visits the Buddha. And I think it's important to point out that Mara still visits the Buddha after he's awakened, which means that he's awakened, but he still gets tormented by this stuff. Mara visits the Buddha and says, basically, who do you think you are? What right do you have to remove yourself from the wheel of samsara, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth? By what right do you claim this sort of awakening? And the Buddha did not respond with words. He simply reached out his hand and he touched the earth. So in traditional stories, the Buddha remained underneath the Bodhi tree or near it. Well, it was a peepal tree and it became a Bodhi tree. And he was in the town of Gaya and it became Bodh Gaya, by the way. So like names change after the awakening. And he remained in that area for 7 weeks. If you go to Bodh Gaya, they actually have like little positions where he supposedly did a week of meditation and then moved on to another one and did another week of meditation. Did this in 7 different sections. But the story is that he really just contemplated the ultimate nature of his awakening, like what it meant. You can imagine he came up with lots of lists, right? The way that we know Buddhism to be. But he thought that that perhaps the Dharma was too difficult to see, that most people wouldn't be able to find awakening. And fortunately for all of us, whether we believe in them or not, a deity heard this thought of the Buddha's and kind of swooped down and visited him and said, hold on a second. There are people with planks in their eye, but there are also people with small motes of dust in their eye, and they can be awakened. And so the Buddha thought of his first teacher in the forest from 6 years earlier, and then realized that he had died a few weeks before. And then he thought of his second teacher and realized that he too had passed away recently. And so what came to mind next were the 5 wandering ascetics that he'd been practicing mortification with, and saw that they were about 500 miles to the west on the outskirts of a town now called Varanasi, and he decided that he would go teach them. So he walked. I imagine it took a while to walk there. And he found them in a place called Isipatana in a deer park, which is kind of a spot of land that was donated by a local king or prince for the work of holy men, a place where they could practice. He found them there, a place today called Sarnath, which is essentially in the city of Varanasi. And they saw him coming, and the stories tell us that they mocked him. They're like, look at this guy, he's so healthy, And but they also were intrigued because he had a countenance about him that he didn't have previously. And so he offered them first the fact that done had to be done, that he had found an end to suffering. And that was enough for them to give him a shot at telling him what he'd found. And so he delivers the first ever Dharma talk in Isipatana, and I'll just quote it, parts of it. I can't read. I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but this is setting in motion the wheel of the Dharma. It's from the Samyutta Nikaya. These 2 extremes are to be avoided by one who has gone forth into homelessness. He's talking about these people practicing the meditation. Which 2? The pursuit of sensual pleasures and the pursuit of self-mortification. This overindulgence in the body and this torturing of the body. Those 2 extremes are to be avoided. Without veering toward those 2 extremes, the Tathagata, which is a title he refers to himself as, has awakened to this middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, and to nirvana. And what is the middle way, awakened to by the Tathagata? It is the Noble Eightfold Path. Now, this is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering. Getting what is displeasing is suffering. Losing what is pleasing is suffering. To not get what one wants is suffering. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is craving that leads to renewed existence, craving for continued existence, and craving for extermination. Now, this is the noble truth of the end of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of that craving, the freedom from it and non-reliance upon it. Now, this is the noble truth leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And when the wheel of Dharma had been set in motion by the Blessed One, the earth-dwelling and sky-dwelling devas let out a cry. At that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry spread as far as the Brahma worlds, and this 10,000-fold world system shook, quaked, trembled, and an immeasurable glorious radiance appeared in the world, surpassing any divine majesty of the devas. And in the next instant, one of the 5 ascetics found awakening. The Buddha gave a second Dharma talk the next day. And then another Dharma talk. And over the course of those Dharma talks, the remaining 4 ascetics that he'd been practicing with all found awakening. And thus, there were 6 awakened beings, awakened to the Dharma, and the Sangha was formed. There was a Buddha, he preached the Dharma, and now there was a Sangha. The Buddha taught this happened around the age of 35, and he taught for 45 years. Pretty remarkable teaching career, if you think about it, to be teaching that long. And we're fortunate to have such a record of his teachings. Obviously, the 6 of them taught others. They taught mostly in what we would think of today as Nepal and northwestern or northeastern India, modern state of Bihar, what was back then called Magadha. I'm not sure how big the Sangha was. There's a lot of arguments about how big it grew, but there is one statement that the Buddha mentions in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the sutta regarding his final liberation, which is what they refer to his death as. He said he had a convocation once of tens of thousands of monks, 1,250 of which were awakened. That's a pretty remarkable number to think about, having more than 1,000 awakened beings. We're not going to say in a room at the same time, but in the forest at the same time, right? It's an amazing thing to think about. At some point in his teaching career, Mara visited the Buddha and tried to discourage him from teaching anymore. He said, you've done enough right here. You've done enough. And the Buddha essentially told him that, I've got a purpose to serve, and that purpose is to teach the Dharma so that it is well understood, establish the Dharma such that it can be repeated and taught and passed down, and establish the Sangha and a code of discipline such that the Sangha can remain. It's my job to make sure the Dharma stays turning as a wheel through time before I die. His teaching method is unique when compared to other spiritual teachers, because some people think he's contradictory, but what he in fact practices in his teaching style is what we call upaya, or skillful means. He was well versed, especially since he had the 6 years in the forest with the completely different spiritual traditions, in addition to his schooling as a prince, he was well versed in all of the spiritual traditions and the debates and the arguments between them. And so he chose to teach them in their language. He didn't seek to dispute the actual teachings or doctrines of the religious traditions of the people he taught to. He just taught to steer them towards the Dharma and whatever means necessary. And so this upaya came to characterize his teaching. So sometimes you'll read about there being 4 feeling tone or different 4 elements or 9 elements or 3 feeling tones or 6 feeling tones or 15, because he taught according to the knowledge and the practices of the people he was teaching to. Another characteristic, another word that we like to use in terms of the way that the Dharma is delivered is ehipassiko, which means come and see. And there's a certain element of non-evangelism that's part of the Dharma. It's one of these things that says, look, I got this thing, you can try it out, see if it works for you. And a lot of people find that it works for them. So he taught for 45 years in this way. And at the age of 80, Mara returned to him to collect on his promise and said, remember that time you said that you would be willing to die once and stop teaching once. You would establish the Sangha and establish the Dharma in such a way that it would be passed on through the ages. And the Buddha looked at Mara and kind of said, you know what? You're right. I have done what I set out to do. And so at that time, at the age of 80, he relinquished the will to live and promised to die in 3 months. Shortly before his death, and eventually the actual cause of his death, a man named Kunda offered to serve him a meal as dana, as alms. And the Buddha was served a meal of what's called pig's delight. And there's a lot of debate about what pig's delight is. Some people think it's candy. Some people think it's like pork. The latest thing I read is that it's truffles, because pigs like truffles. But anyways, he was served a meal of pig's delight, which, quote, led to extreme sickness, bloody diarrhea, and sharp pains, but that the Buddha endured all of it mindfully and clearly aware without complaint. And despite his pain, and despite his diarrhea, and despite his sickness, and despite the fact that the Buddha knew that this meal would kill him, he praised Kunda, the man who had provided him with the meal, telling him that it was a significant amount of merit that he had established by giving and practicing generosity. Intention, we must remember, is the be-all and end-all of karma and thus of the Dharma. So during his illness, he held a final assembly. He gathered the Sangha around him and spoke to Ananda and the Sangha. Ananda was his chief attendant. And I'll quote him again here. It may be that you think, Sangha, the teacher's instruction has ceased. Now we have no teacher, but it should not be seen like this. For what I have taught and explained to you is the Dharma, and the discipline will, at my passing, be your teacher. Let me repeat that. The Dharma will be your teacher. Then the Buddha addressed the monks, saying, it may be that some of you have doubts or uncertainty about the Buddha, about the Dharma, about the Sangha, the path or the practice. Ask now, monks. Do not afterward feel remorse, thinking the teacher was there before us and we failed to ask him when we were face to face. And at this, the Sangha was silent. The Buddha asked one more time, and not a word. And the Buddha asked the third time, and they didn't respond. And so the Buddha said to the monks, now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of the nature to decay. Strive on with earnestness. These were the final words of the Buddha. He entered into meditative absorption and progressed into deeper and more subtle levels of awareness. At the moment of his final breath, there was a great earthquake, terrible and hair-raising, accompanied by thunder. A deity from the heavens uttered for all the world to hear. All beings of the world, all bodies must break up, even the teachers, peerless in the human world. The mighty Lord and perfect Buddha has passed away. So the Buddha's body was wrapped and placed in a funeral pyre in the traditional way. People came to come and wash his feet. They say they got little strands of his robes to keep, which is why sometimes if you go on a Buddhist retreat today, you'll tie a strand of string around your wrist, kind of like hearkening back to the strands removed from his robes. The story goes that after X number of days of viewing, the funeral pyre self-ignited, that he was turned to dust, and that when it was completed, the heavens opened up and put the fire out. The relics, which remained, fragments of his bones, were scattered throughout all of India, but were delivered to eight principal stupas. A stupa is like kind of like the mounds that have become to characterize as a kind of indicative of a Buddhist shrine. They started out just as like domes, and now they've got turned into like pretty elaborate things. There was an assembly a number of months later in which Ananda, the chief attendant, who is supposedly had the mindfulness such that he could remember every sermon of the suttas, every sermon that the Buddha had delivered. He was able to recite them, and the suttas and scriptures started to get memorized from that point on. And as we know, it spread. Here we are, 2,500 years later. There are three major schools of Buddhism, and more than 500 million of us. We all take refuge in the fact of the Buddha and the potential for our own awakening. We all take refuge in the Dharma as a guiding light for our own personal practice, and we all take refuge in the Sangha and in each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Every time I listen to the story of the Buddha, and at the part where you mentioned about the refuge, traditionally, people go and seek for refuge during these celebrations. So I have the honor today to guide you guys in taking the refuge in the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma. And I remember, I think I shared this story with Matt and Nancy before, when I was incarcerated, and we had a Vesak celebration, and we had a monk coming in, and he led the ceremony. And at the end, he asked the participant to take refuge, take the 3 refuge and the 5 precepts. It's part of the tradition. And a lot of the men were attending, and I seen Eric nodding his head because he was there. A lot of men were attending just because it was a celebration. They didn't expect to take refuge. And so a lot of them were asking the monk, what does taking refuge mean? And the monk, he had a very clever way of explaining it, I think is applicable. And he said that taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha can be taken internally or externally. And he explained that externally, we can look at the Buddha as a medicine man, he said. Because as we listen to the story of the Buddha, we realize, I mean, I can understand why your friend, I forgot his name, was actually shed tear at the part when the Buddha left home, left Yashodhara and Rahula, which is his newborn son. I think perhaps in his mind that he already see the suffering that they will endorse, and that it takes the strength within him to actually leave them in order for him to find a path to liberate them. And I think that's one of the biggest sacrifice I think a man can do, to leave his own household in order to find liberation for them. And so the emphasis on recognizing suffering and the cost of suffering is what really taking refuge is about, in my understanding. Refuge is we finding someone to lean on or a source for safety, right? So he explained to the men that if you recognize that you are sick, then you will seek out a doctor. And the doctor will give you a diagnosis, and then he will give you the teaching, which is the Dharma. And he will give you the medicine. But sometimes, so the medicine is the Dharma. And he says sometimes you need help to take medicine. And that's where the Sangha come in. You need nurses. And these are people that are also taking this path, that are able to help you if you can't take the medicine yourself or not willing to. So I think it's the beautiful way to frame it, that we can look at the Buddha as a medicine teacher, a medicine man, the Dharma as medicine, and the Sangha as in nurses that can help us. And then the other part, just like Matt say, is the taking the refuge internally, relying on our true nature, believing that there is a available source of wisdom and compassion that we already have to overcome the suffering, overcome our own suffering, and enable us to help overcome other people's suffering. It's there and is available to us. It's have always been there. So I will lead you into the traditional recitation of the three refuge. I'm reciting Pali. Please do not mind if I don't pronounce it right. So I will recite it the first 3 times, and I'll hit the bell, and then traditionally is always recite, first time is always recite 3 times. I think back then it's for perfect memorization, I think, for them to, everything is repeated 3 times. So I'm going to start reciting. Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami.
Yeah, I like to hear this. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. And now we will leave the floor open for discussion or sharing or